Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Spawn vs. Batman. Now, Spawn vs. Batman is a one-shot comic book written by Frank Miller and illustrated by Todd McFarlane and published by DC and Image Comics. Now, this was published in 1994, and this is a crossover comic featuring the character of Spawn, originally created by Todd McFarlane, who also illustrated the book, and it also features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Now, even though this is a crossover between Batman and Spawn, the book is not set in either continuity. Like, it's not set in the mainstream DC continuity, and it's also not set in the mainstream Spawn continuity. Now, I will admit, I have never read any of the official Spawn comics, but I would say I'm familiar enough with the character. Like, I've seen that movie that was made off the Spawn comics, which really wasn't very good, but there was also an animated television series in the late 90s, which aired on HBO, and that was freaking phenomenal. Like, that was a really good show. I would say, even though I haven't read any of the official Spawn comics, I'm familiar enough with the character to know his origin and stuff like that. Now, the Spawn comics follow a man named Al Simmons, who was an assassin who ended up getting murdered. Now, because he was an assassin, his soul was condemned to hell, but while in hell, he ended up making a deal with a demon called Malbolgia, and the deal was he can return to Earth and see his wife again, but the catch is he has to return to Earth as a demonic entity known as a Hellspawn. And it turns out that there's this war going on between heaven and hell, and Malbolgia is essentially planning this massive invasion of heaven and earth, and basically he wants the Hellspawn, Al Simmons, to lead Hell's army, and basically the Spawn comics follow the character of Spawn having to rebel against Malbolgia. And that's what I know about the Spawn comics, even though I haven't read any of the official Spawn comics. That's what I know about them, really based on what I saw from the movie and the TV show. But once again, this book is not set in the mainstream Spawn continuity, nor is it set in the mainstream Batman continuity. This book is set entirely in its own universe. However, I have heard that Frank Miller said that apparently this book is set in the same universe as his Batman graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns, but then again, that was already set in its own universe. Apparently, all of Frank Miller's Batman stories do take place in the same world, and this book is set in the continuity of Frank Miller's Batman stories, which are separate from the mainstream DC continuity. Now, the plot of Spawn vs. Batman is, it begins where Batman does battle with this cyborg, and he ends up destroying it, but he finds the head of a human being inside the cyborg, and the head is actually still talking, and basically he starts investigating into this, and his investigations eventually lead him to New York City. So while in New York City, Batman comes face to face with Spawn, and he sees that Spawn is outright killing evil people, and Batman is against killing no matter how evil that person actually is. So Batman and Spawn end up being enemies in the beginning of this story, but they ultimately realize that they're both after the same person, and they begrudgingly come together to try to stop this person. Now, the main villain of the book is this woman who is kidnapping homeless people and turning them into cyborgs, and it turns out that she has a plan for world domination, and now Batman and Spawn have to team up to stop her, and that's the basic plotline of Spawn vs. Batman. Now, I thought Spawn vs. Batman was a really interesting read, and I would definitely recommend, if you haven't read this already, definitely check this out and give it a read. Now, once again, I haven't read any of the official Spawn comics, so I can't really compare this to, like, the mainstream Spawn series, and I can't really say, oh, if you're a fan of the Spawn character, you'll like this, because once again, I don't really know how this compares to the mainstream Spawn comics. Then again, I have seen the TV show, and I would say, as a fan of the TV show, I would say I enjoyed this a lot. Now, as far as, like, Frank Miller's Batman stories go, this is definitely not as good as The Dark Knight Returns, but then again, The Dark Knight Returns, it's like, that's like almost like a masterpiece in my eyes, and it's very hard to top something like that, and once again, this book, it's nowhere near as complex as that book was, but once again, it's a fun read, and I would definitely recommend this. Now, also published in 1994 was another Batman and Spawn crossover comic called War Devil, which was written by Chuck Dixon and Doug Moach and Alan Grant. Now, I initially thought before I read it that that was actually going to be a sequel to this one, but that's actually set in its own continuity as well, and that's going to be my next book review, actually. So yeah, that was my review on Spawn vs. Batman by Frank Miller, and bye.